But I'll start with a housekeeping point. It's interesting, this IPA study that came out on Brazil. I was, in my last job, when I was in the Ministry of Finance, I was actually asked, because of my UN background, to do something very similar for India. And we discovered that, depending on how you call it, these are gross underestimates. By the time I started and when I finished, I found that actually India's spend on different forms of cooperation exceeded $1.5 billion a year and was likely to double in the next 3 years, and that's happening. I suspect something very similar will happen with Brazil, and I'd like your view on this, that one other thing I've noticed in Brazil is that commitments are not spent. The most remarkable thing about EBC's budget is it's not spent. There are huge amounts of EBC resources sloshing around in UNDP funds, in other places, while at the same time commitments made by Brazil are not kept, particularly to international organizations. Now that's a separate political issue, but I'm making an accounting point, that there is a mismatch between the point at which you view a certain sum committed and its actual spending, because of problems in orçamento in Brazil, which we're all familiar with, some of us are. Okay, let me start my provocative comments now by saying that I think the most important distinction that was drawn today is between developed and developing countries, and that has not changed. And as I've been saying yesterday, that is not going to change whatever happens to the GDP of China or India or Brazil in my lifetime and probably his lifetime, by all estimates. Okay? These are going to be large GDP, poor countries. So one stylized fact, they're all going to be developing countries. It's very important, in my view. Because if they're all going to be developing countries, and there are developed countries, then the distinction between North and South is not going to go away unless you can convince me, and I'm willing to be convinced, that this difference in levels of development will not result in an ossification, with some changes at the margin, in the international balance of power. That is not going to change. It may alter at the margins, but it's not going to change fundamentally. It may change for China in certain military ways. But in terms of the problematique of having a mass of people who share the common experience of deprivation and underdevelopment, Brazil, India, South Africa, China are going to be firmly in the South just as they are today. So in that context, it means that the shared political history which underpinned South-South cooperation as the UN defines it will still in substantial measure remain in the future. And I would argue, therefore, Miguel, that if that is the case, then the expectations from South-South cooperation are fundamentally continue to be political in nature. They're not about plumbing. They're about architecture. The problem, the grouse, the big political grouse, which Brazil has recently joined, but India, China, within the G77 have been part of for a long time, is that there is a flaw in the architecture of relations, development relations between countries, whether reflected in the bank and the fund or elsewhere, which, if not fixed, makes virtuous improvements in plumbing and exchange of technology, etc., nice, but at best irrelevant and at worst malfeasant in drawing attention away from the main problem. Here, if we look at the emerging economies, I'm afraid the verdict on South-South cooperation is very dismal. Because the one thing that emerging economies can do now with the shared political history and solidarity is change the terms of policy dialogue. It's not about providing Bolsa Familia. It's about saying that it matters that you can actually accelerate poverty reduction and reduction in vulnerability faster than you thought you could, and that the donors told us, and the bank told us, and the fund told us, and Brazil can show you how that's done, and you can have a good crisis with it, and so can India, etc. That's a policy dialogue issue. And where I think India, Brazil, China collectively have failed spectacularly is in providing zero, and I mean zero, intellectual input to this debate within the major multilateral institutions, including the UN, but more importantly, the bank and the fund as well. Their voice is not there. The Development Committee of the G20, the Development Working Group, is the one place where these countries are conspicuously absent. Now, I think that is the major challenge to the role of emerging economies in South-South cooperation. And therefore, in a sense, I'm worried that there is a presumption, which I found to some extent only, because at the end you made it very clear. There is a presumption within the establishment that is building up in Brazil, India, South Africa, which is the same presumption that I think was made in error by countries like, by traditional donors, that cooperation is for development. It's not. Development is a byproduct of cooperation in South-South cooperation, in my view. And I think this is the line they should be taking. Cooperation is about making sure that the bad things that are caused by an unequal international division of labor and international balance of power can and should be resisted, and that resistance, one of the instruments of that resistance is South-South cooperation. It's a different premise from nice development, as I call it, happy stuff. You know, I have a well, I can show you how to dig a well, let's dig wells, yeah, nice. And that is the premise that informs, but this is an ugly world, and you know, the history of aid is an ugly history. It's not a very nice history, most of all in this continent. And to forget that, I think, is a breathtaking leap of faith, which I'm certainly not willing to take. It's impressive that in Latin America you are. I said I'd be provocative. Okay. The third problem is a silo approach. There's a complete lack of willingness to share and engage experiences between the emerging economies. I work with them very closely, and I'm unable to convince Brazil, my host country, to share an iota of information on a systematic basis with China. And of course, that is tied to a suspicion of China in Brazil, and the same is true for India, and the same is true for Turkey, for that matter. There is no willingness to set up a consistent policy dialogue forum outside the OECD where development cooperation can be shared, notwithstanding the fact that there's a central ally in Africa that they all claim to have called South Africa. But when you talk about the India-Africa Summit or the Brazil-Africa exchanges, South Africa is not in the picture. That would be a great example of triangulation, a political example. It's not there. Bad habits. The emergence of bad habits in the business process of providing cooperation are very evident to me in Brazil, in India, and in China. Where should I start? The most obvious one, clientelism. There is now enough evidence, I think, that China is always picked, but I don't think Brazil has a better record. If you ask, what is Brazil doing in the Lusophone countries, and who is it doing it with, I don't get an answer. And the answer ought to be there, because this is something that needs to be proven upfront by developing countries if they want to establish that their business processes are different. That if Brazil is working in Angola, it is not working largely with Angolan elites, but elsewhere. India, I can promise you, is doing exactly that. It is working principally with elites for elite gains. These are clientelist clubs. And I think this is something that in South-South cooperation is going to become more and more strident, and the emerging economies have a great responsibility to address upfront. And this is something I think I would add in your exposition of the challenge. It's a very important challenge. Okay. So I've already said that South-South cooperation I don't think is about development. Development is a byproduct and externality. And then, thank you, Bruno, for that exposition on triangular cooperation. It's the best, I think, exposition I've seen, because what I normally get, especially in the countries I work with, India, China, is a deafening silence on triangular cooperation, what it is, why it should be there. So this is the first systematic attempt. Now, I think I'd like to sort of interrogate you a little further on what you said. Burden sharing by the North. I would add one change there. You see, the North has a particular accounting problem. Europe. When I say North, I mean Europe, because one nice thing about the United States and Japan is they're not interested largely in triangular cooperation. It's mainly Europe. And Europe is doing it, in my view, for a fiscal reason. The fiscal reason is that European countries are under great pressure to cut civil service budgets. But they're also under great pressure to increase aid spend. TIFID is a classic example of this. Now, how do you do that? You can either push money in the direction of the multilaterals, but you don't like the multilaterals, or the recipient countries don't like certain multilaterals. So there's a limit now. Developing countries are fed up with the bank. So all of, I'm taking DFID deliberately because they're not in the room, all of DFID's posturing with the bank is now not acceptable to many developing countries. They just won't take your money. So what do? You go to the UN, you don't like the UN, because the UN is too, it's too G77, it's too much. There's too much consensus, I can't have my way, they won't appoint my JPOs, so let's not go there. Triangular cooperation, now this is nice, because here I can develop clientelist relationships with people like me, the civil service in these countries. And so I think Europe has that incentive, and I'd like your reaction to this, to go in for that sort of burden sharing. For the South, I think there is a danger of insertion, but there is also the shared interest that many countries in the South, I won't comment on Brazil, but certainly India and China, shared with the US on not being too transparent about what they do with their South-South cooperation, simply because it's an instrument of foreign policy. For virtuous reasons, if you take my paradigmatic outset that the thing that I set out earlier, that it's part of a game, and it's a war game, and war games are not transparent. The US is pretty transparent about this, but in Europe there are no cost to transparency because they're not playing this game. So I'd like your reaction to that too. Now, on the question of receiving and getting aid, I'd like the entire panel's reaction to one question I have, which is that it is my impression that the majority of talk about South-South cooperation, or let me say the incremental talk about South-South cooperation, seems to be happening in the countries of the North now. I don't actually see many initiatives coming out of India or China or even Brazil on South-South cooperation. They're doing some stuff, they'll always do it. The majority of intellectual initiatives are coming out there. With aid, I don't know about Brazil, it'll be interesting to know from any of the panel, but with India, I remember in 2006, India came to the conclusion that certain donors were more trouble than they were worth. So very politely, they asked the Scandinavians and the Canadians to leave. And they didn't want to leave. They just didn't want to leave. I've personally given evidence in the House of Commons to Parliament in Britain saying that I think DFID should not have a program in India. Please go away. You're wasting your money. It's all captured by special interest groups, etc. DFID knows this. But DFID doesn't want to leave. So sometimes you get aid in spite of not wanting it. And that is for a very valid and logical political reason. It's great leverage with interest groups. But this also must be addressed when one looks at the apparent paradox of why people get aid and then don't get aid. I have two closing points. There is, I think, another constituency which would be useful to get your views on triangulation and on South-South cooperation, and that is the important constituency of the multinational NGO. Because the business model of the multinational NGO is very interesting, ActionAid. Okay, they're headquartered somewhere in the north, but they have a lot of decentralized responsibility given to sort of loose fiefdoms in the south. So you have ActionAid India, ActionAid Brazil, very independent, but there is a collective structure which ends in the north. And these are proponents, I think, of South-South cooperation in ways I'm not persuaded are always or necessarily benign. My final point is, again, a question to my Brazilian colleague, that there is a perception, I think, in the rest of the emerging South that Brazil has a greater preference, perhaps, than countries in other continents for cooperation with the OECD countries. And this is notwithstanding, I think, Brazil's very clear stance that it will not join the OECD under any circumstances at this time. But there remains this perception that Brazil is more interested in undertaking joint cooperation, let me not call it triangular, with the OECD countries than it perhaps is with other emerging countries, which is in stark contrast to its political line, which is, Iran, somebody mentioned yesterday, Iran, Iran, Turkey, Brazil, Iran, that wonderful moment in world history, which is in striking contrast to the perception one has of Brazilian development cooperation. And again, I'd like your reaction to how this unfolds. I'll stop there. Thank you.